Hello, valued viewers. I hope you're all doing very well. Today's poll question is, what railroad stands out as the most iconic for you? Mine would be the Pennsylvania Railroad simply because of monopoly. And I guess you could throw in the B&O Railroad and the Reading as equals in that. But it certainly, as a kid, drove my interest in the railroads. And lastly about that, I definitely think you should have collected at least $500 for if you had a monopoly on all four railroads. Let me know in the comments below if you think you got ripped off the $200 rent that you collect for getting all four railroads. All fun aside, I'll start today's video this way, and it might raise the dander of some of my viewers, and that's okay. But in my opinion, the Pennsylvania Railroad is probably the most disappointing of the iconic railroads, simply because of their arrogant business practices throughout the decades, leading up to the ill-fated Pennsylvania and New York Central merger, which the fallout from that merger was just simply a microcosm of the Pensy's operation on the whole during the prior decades. And my feelings stem from basically always falling behind in steam locomotive technologies, where other railroads were developing northerns and mountain type passenger locomotives. You got Union Pacific doing a Challenger, and the superpower steam locomotives like the Allegheny and Big Boys and all that, and the super articulated type powers were being developed. And here's the Pennsylvania Railroad just kind of lackadaisically, hanging on to their K4s and trying to electrify their lines, and just unsound business practices, leading up to the New York Central Pennsylvania merger. And I do think that stems from a corporate arrogance within the Pennsylvania Railroad itself, thinking they're better than everyone else, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, their competition was just slowly encroaching in on their areas, creating redundant railroad services. You had the Chesapeake and Ohio, the B&O Railroad, the Norfolk and Western, and the New York Central, all operating with that general region. Some of them were going to have to be merged later on in life, and that certainly was the case. But, had the Pennsylvania Railroad ran a much sounder business practice, they would not, in my opinion, would not have been one of those companies to have been forced to merge in the 50s and 60s. And of course, as it turns out, we all know that the Norfolk and Western just swooped right in and took control of that region for the most part. And then later, they absorbed the Southern Railroad as well. And now you have a north-south, east and west operation at Norfolk and Western, and then Norfolk Southern became dominant. So if I ruffled some feathers, I do apologize, but that's just the way I feel. Pennsylvania Railroad is probably the most disappointing iconic railroad in my mind for those basic reasons. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the simplistic reasoning behind my thinking. And folks, if you'd like to see me do videos on the railroads themselves, I do have extensive knowledge and resources to do videos on individual railroads. So if you would like to see those kinds of videos, let me know in the comments below, and I will take note of it. Okay, so the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1, or as I like to refer to it as personally as the 4 of a kind, because of its duplex drive of 4-4-4-4 wheel arrangements. And in a nutshell, it was a good idea that was simply executed poorly. And to be sharp about it, not surprisingly, coming from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The T1 was simply a very unique design. None of the kinks and flaws to the design were really adequately worked out. Training of the engineering crew was very poor, and you combine all those elements, you're going to get a failed project overall. But the locomotive itself was one of the most sophisticated, most powerful, and one of the fastest ever built. And the streamlining by Raymond Loewy was very unique and iconic as well. And among several issues, one of the bigger issues with the T1 design was the wheel slippage upon startup and also during operations. The wheels were prone to slipping. And part of that was due to poor training of the engineering crew, you know, as far as applying the throttle and, you know, and what amount, you know, to set it to and all that on startup. But overall, the design was prone to slipping. And a more root cause of that was basically the springs that supported the drivers were way too stiff, and the equalization of the pressure applied from the springs were not stable either. So what you got were the drivers were equalized together, but they weren't equalized with the engine truck. And to their credit, toward the problem, the Pennsylvania Railroad was able to equalize the engine truck and the front engine and the trailing truck with the rear engine, which went a long way to help solving this wheel slip problem. So to go back a little bit on the T1's history, the Pennsylvania Railroad actually developed a S1 prototype with help from Baldwin as an experimental, and that locomotive number was 6100, and it came out in 1935. The S1 managed to reach almost 101 miles an hour on level track, pulling a 1,350-ton passenger train. The performance of the S1 encouraged the Pennsylvania Railroad to continue to develop duplex steam locomotives. So that was the motivation to continue the program and then eventually develop the T1. And some of the lessons learned from the S1 was, first of all, the locomotive was way too big. It couldn't run on nearly all of the Pennsylvania Railroad's track. So that was a major issue that they had to solve in designs leading up to the T1. So the PRR had to work with Baldwin in getting the locomotive into a smaller scale, but still maintained a duplex design. So in 1940, Baldwin developed two prototypes, number 6110 and 6111, and they cost $600,000 each, which is a buttload of cash during 1940. And both prototypes had teething problems, as you might expect, besides the wheel slippage. But overall, there were favorable enough tests that resulted in a production order of 50 T1s by the Pennsylvania Railroad from Baldwin, and also their own Altoona locomotive works as well. Okay, so Altoona and Baldwin both finished their first production T1s in November of 1945. Altoona completed 8 of the engines by the end of the year, and Baldwin had completed 5 of them. The remaining 37 engines, 17 from Altoona and 20 from Baldwin, were delivered in 1946. The last Altoona-built T1, number 5524, was completed in June of 1946, and it ended up being the last steam locomotive ever built by the Altoona Locomotive Works. The last Baldwin T1 was delivered in August of 1946. Each engine, without its tender, costs around $250,000, which is not nearly the $600,000 that the prototypes cost. So, like the prototypes, the production models actually had started experiencing slipping problems very frequently. So, the Pennsylvania Railroad had to modify the T1s with sandboxes that deposited sand along the tracks just ahead of the locomotive to help this slipping problem once again. And again, some of the problem was from engineers not knowing how to throttle up this locomotive to keep the wheels from slipping as well. So that was the lesser part of the problem, but the locomotive in general still, even in production, had slipping problems. And these problems were generally encountered in up to speeds of 25 miles an hour. So some residual problems from the wheel slipping was that they damaged the engine's poppet valves, was the unique technology pretty much exclusive to the T1. And also the maintenance and repair of the valves and their control and drive boxes proved to be extremely difficult as well. So it was very difficult to maintain the T1's maintenance. And furthermore, the design itself limited where the locomotive could be maintenance at. So it had to be done over a maintenance pit or pretty much nowhere. And also a problem with the locomotive's design was causing unpredictable valve failures running at high speed. And they never really got to the source of that problem. So frustrated by these valve failures, Franklin, the manufacturer of these valves, who had guaranteed the valves would operate continuously at speeds of about 100 miles an hour, and it could also handle short bursts up to 125 miles an hour. But these valves were failing at the higher speed, so frustrated by these failures and not able to find a source of them, Franklin basically put observers to secretly ride on the T1 trains over about a month's period of time, and they found some really interesting performance and driver habits or engineer habits along the way during those time, and found in those secret observer logs where the T1s were often operated in excess of 130 miles an hour to make up time. One train was even clocked at 142 miles an hour on several miles. Even if one calculation was done in error, the numerous times the T1 was calculated at over 130 miles an hour could not all be mistakes. The speedometer in the cab of the locomotive stopped at 120. So it goes without saying that the T1 could easily break the Mallard's recorded speed world record for steam locomotives, no doubt about it. And I'll add that many other types of locomotives could do this as well, notably the Southern Pacific's Daylight. You know, that's one off the top of my head. So upon discovering these extremely high speeds, the Franklin management decided that the best way to handle it was not to tell the Pennsylvania Railroad that their engineers were overclocking their locomotives. So pretty satisfied they were finding the source of their valve failures, Franklin management just basically found better metallurgy to build their or manufacture their valves for the T1 rather than turn in these engineers for overspeeding the locomotives. So in 1946, the Pennsylvania Railroad actually loaned a couple of T1s to the Chesapeake in Ohio. And what's interesting about this is the C&O engineers didn't have any problems with wheel slippage at all. And these engineers had never driven one before. So what's going on with that? Who knows? But that was the finding, though. So all in all, the T1 wasn't in service for very long. I mean, the Pennsylvania Railroad started dieselization en masse, and by 1949, the T1s were going out of service. And by the end of 1945, most of the T1s had already been withdrawn from service altogether. And all of them had been dropped from the roster altogether by 1953, with scrapping of the engines beginning in 1951. Sadly, none of the T1 original locomotives were preserved. You know, of course, this is beginning to be a recurring theme among classic and historic steam locomotive types not being preserved. But in 2013, the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 Steam Locomotive Trust was founded to build a new PIR T1 locomotive replica, number 5550. And since its inception up until the mid-2020s, the T1 Trust had acquired or completed 34% of the new engine, and its tender had numerous other parts and components on order. It is the intention of the T1 Trust to complete the number 5550 by 2030 and to make the engine available for special excursion service. The T1 Trust also hopes to use the number 5550 for an attempt to break the world land speed record for a steam locomotive, which was set by the British A4 Mallard at 125.88, which is not really official either, but that's the number I had before me. But good luck to them, and I hope they find a track to do it during that time frame. I'm not sure if any company's mainline tracks are available for that kind of excursion or trying to set a record that way, but we'll see. But I provided the link in the write-up of this video to help support these guys if you guys want to donate toward their efforts of completing this T1 5550 replica. So with that, the following specifications apply to the T1 locomotive by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The overall length of the locomotive was 122 feet, 9 3/4 inches. The width of the locomotive was 11 feet 1 inch. The height of the locomotive was 15 feet 6 inches. The axle load was 71,680 pounds. The adhesive weight over the drivers was 279,910 pounds. The locomotive weight was 502,200 pounds. The tender was 442,500 pounds for a combined locomotive weight of 944,700 pounds. The T1 locomotive had 80-inch driving wheels. The locomotive used coal for fuel, and it could carry 38.65 tons. The water capacity was 19,200 U.S. gallons. The firebox grade area was 92 square feet. The boiler was 100 inches. The boiler pressure was 300 pounds per square inch. Heating surface was 5,639 square feet. The firebox itself was 590 square feet. The locomotive had 4 cylinders at 19 3/4 inches by 26 inches. The valve gear was by Franklin, and the valve types were poppet valves, also by Franklin. The maximum speed was over 140 miles an hour. The power output was 6,500 horsepower. The tractive effort was 64,653 pounds, and the factor of adhesion was 4.33. I think one of the problems with the wheel slippage too was the too high of a tractive effort, because that factor of adhesion is extremely high as well. And so I think the tractive effort may have contributed to the wheel slipping problem as well. So there were 52 total T1s built, and the railroad classification obviously was T1, and all were scrapped with the exception of the one replica build that I mentioned earlier, the 5550, which is under construction, and that's in St. Louis, Missouri as we speak. And with that, I'll wrap up this video, and I will end it by saying thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed the content today, please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed to the channel already. Hit the like button and turn on all of your notifications, and visit our print shop at nickelplatelimited.etsy.com. Thank you very much.